Role-playing games are often defined by their characters. Not just the companions, love interests, and the villains, but the player character as well. It is something that can be overlooked since so often the player character in an RPG is kind of a blank slate. By this I mean that player character has no pre-established backstory or characteristics aside from simply being the hero. Perfect examples of this can be seen in Skyrim, where the only defining characteristic of your character is that you are the Dragonborn, or in Dragon Age Origins, where you are the Grey Warden and everything else is inconsequential, so to speak. However, this is not always the case. Many role-playing games, such as the Witcher series or older games like Planescape Torment, choose to instead make the player character an integral part of the story as a predetermined character, much like the rest of the characters in the story. Using those games as a base, the contrast between blank slate characters and predetermined characters will be looked at. The purpose of this video is not to suggest that one type is better than the other, but just to kind of highlight the differences and what to expect from games that go one way or the other. My desire to explore this topic was sparked by my love for the Witcher franchise. Not only have I played the games extensively, I have also spent considerable time reading about them. I do this because, in the case of The Witcher 3, a game I consider to be a modern masterpiece, I enjoy reading about other people who loved it like I did, but also I like to know why some people didn't like it. The Witcher 3 is certainly not a perfect game. The combat in particular stands out as decent at best. However, one criticism stood out in particular. Many people do not want to play or do not enjoy The Witcher because they are forced to play it as The Witcher, Geralt of Rivia. Geralt is a predetermined character with an extensive backstory and pre-existing characteristics, as well as pre-existing relationships with many of the characters in the game. While I can understand why someone who enjoys the blank slate kind of player character would feel put off by a game like The Witcher, I also feel that it is a great disservice to pass on such games for this reason alone. It is true that games like Skyrim or Dragon Age Origins or older Infinity Engine type games like Baldur's Gate, and the more recent games of those styles like Pillars of Eternity or Divinity Original Sin, have a degree of freedom to them that is lacking in games like The Witcher or other narrative-driven role-playing games with predetermined player characters. However, games like The Witcher and Planescape Torment make up for the lack of freedom in one key category: story. I believe that RPGs with predetermined characters have a higher potential for quality storytelling overall. Not to say that Dragon Age Origins and others like it lack in quality story, they simply just do not measure up to the high points of storytelling found in The Witcher and Planescape. The reason for this is that these games can tell more personal, tight, and concise stories. There are less variables to account for, and thus it is easier to write a compelling narrative. For an example, I'm going to go into some slight Witcher 3 spoilers, so skip ahead if you don't want to hear this. So in The Witcher 3, for example, one of the core aspects of the game's narrative is Geralt's love for his adoptive daughter Ciri. This love is unconditional. No matter how much of an asshole you make Geralt out to be during the game, he will always love her. This takes away some player agency, but in return the player is rewarded with exceptional moments of narrative between these two characters. Moments that would not have been available or would have had the same impact had the developers allowed for more freedom for the player to define Geralt. A similar experience can be had in Planescape Torment, which again, slight spoilers ahead. You can see a similar payoff in this game, as you learn that almost every companion you travel with knew you before you lost your memories. It adds depth to their character as well as the Nameless One, and allows for powerful emotional moments towards the end of the game. Despite this, games with predetermined characters don't completely ignore player agency. There is in fact a common trope in such games to allow for player agency with such a character, and that is amnesia. Both the first Witcher game and Planescape's Torment start with the player character having no real memory of who they are. This allows for the player to redefine themselves in some capacities, while still retaining who the character is at its core. Both Geralt and the Nameless One can be altered and defined by the decisions the player makes over the course of the game, but the essence of who the character is still mostly stays the same. In other words, the player is taking a character and seeing how that character's life would have gone had different decisions been made. No matter how many people play The Witcher, Geralt is still the same guy who just may have walked a different path. Each instance of the game being kind of a parallel universe for this same character. This contrasts with games like Dragon Age Origins and Skyrim, where the player characters can be fundamentally different from one another, from player to player. Less like a parallel universe of the same person, and more like a completely different reality. Despite my love for The Witcher and Planescape, I by no means have anything against games like Skyrim or Dragon Age Origins, or the idea of a blank slate player character in general. In fact, Skyrim and Dragon Age Origins are two of my favorite games, and while narratively they may not hit the same highs as The Witcher or Planescape, they offer something else entirely. Deep role-playing alongside extensive player agency, and the freedom to let my imagination do some work and run wild. Dragon Age Origins succeeds because it weaves various different options in player development and in the player's own origins together into a cohesive whole that still manages to tell a compelling enough story with a strong cast of characters. It may not necessarily reach the same emotional highs in storytelling department as like The Witcher, but for many gamers, including myself, that's an acceptable sacrifice for the freedom that is given in return. In Dragon Age, you truly feel like the master of your own fate, and that you have the fate of the world in your hands. It is a classic BioWare tale done to perfection. Skyrim 2 sacrifices narrative. I'd argue more so than Dragon Age, as the main quest of Skyrim is hardly its highlight, but in return it gives players unparalleled role-playing and freedom. And this is why Skyrim is so enduring and still getting re-released onto new systems almost 7 years after launch. Every playthrough can be completely different based on how you want to play it. For those of us that like to take our role-playing to the next level, the openness and freedom in Skyrim allows us as a player to craft our own backstory and personal narrative into the world. We can choose to be the heroic Nord who defends his home by running into battle with his great axe, or we can be a bloodthirsty orc or a scheming high elf wizard. The point is, the only real limitation is your imagination, whereas for The Witcher, the limits are much tighter in order to provide the more powerful and tight narrative. I don't want to create the impression here that I believe that an RPG needs to go one route or another when it comes to its player character. An RPG does not need to limit itself. There is a middle ground, and it's a middle ground that BioWare, in its prime, walked with incredible success, and it's a middle ground that Bethesda recently tried to walk itself and failed. BioWare is known for many great role-playing games, but one that stands out in regards to the topic of player character is Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. Massive spoilers ahead, so if somehow you haven't played Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, just skip ahead. I'll mark when spoilers are done. Knights of the Old Republic did a lot of good things. It had a compelling narrative, great role-playing features, and brought Star Wars to new and fresh frontiers. Despite all this, its most resounding success is its main character, Revan. The game starts in pretty typical role-playing game fashion. You're a Republic soldier who gets caught up in a conflict between these, almost godlike figures, the Dark Lord Malak and a young famous Jedi named Bastila Shan, and it has the makings for a typical hero's journey. And for a good 2/3 of the game, this narrative trope holds up. The player trudges along as this nobody who is surprisingly strong in the Force. Furthermore, the player is given total freedom to build and shape their character as they see fit. However, all this gets thrown into disarray by the end of the second act as BioWare delivers one of gaming's greatest plot twists. It turns out your character is not some nobody Republic soldier, but the long-thought dead Dark Lord Revan, Malak's old master. This revelation throws everything the player thought about themselves out the window, and is perhaps the only example I can think of where a game starts with a blank slate player character, but shifts to a predetermined character more than halfway through, and it utterly changes the narrative. It forces the player to rethink every decision they have made, to rethink every relationship they have with their companions, and to rethink how they want to play the game. For example, I played most of the game as an indecisive kind of grey Jedi, but when I found out who I really was, it completely changed me, and I went full dark side for the remainder of the game. I rethought every relationship I had, and some of them changed dramatically as a result. Ultimately, the fate of the galaxy shift based on who I really was as opposed to who I had created myself to be at the start of the game. This is one of gaming's greatest narrative triumphs and shows the power of the predetermined character. Even though you are unaware for most of the game, it still permeates the experience because many of the characters you encounter do know who you really are, and it affects how they act around you. The clues to the player's true identity are quite obvious to spot after you're made aware of this truth. Regardless, the revelation that the player is Revan shaped this game and took it from a typical good versus evil Star Wars tale and made it something far greater. That's the end of the spoilers. This is perhaps the best example of a near-perfect player character, a melding of blank slate and predetermined that worked perfectly.
Any reckless behavior on your part is likely to affect me as well. I believe you truly mean what you say, for now, but sometimes it is not so easy to keep such promises. Your power could be a gift or a curse. When you need guidance or advice or support, I will do my best to help you stay on the path of the light. I only hope I have the wisdom to help you through the dark times. But for now, we should return to our mission.
However, Bethesda attempted a similar strategy with its latest title, Fallout 4, that did not work out so well. Bethesda Game Studios has long been the champion of blank slate player characters and open world role-playing games. More recently though, it tried its hand at a more narrative experience with a more predetermined character in Fallout 4, and failed. The problems and failings of Fallout 4 as a whole are too numerous to list here, but perhaps its most glaring misstep, or at least one of them, was the player character. Bethesda attempted to create a more narrative experience with Fallout 4, but failed to deliver one worthy of the sacrifices that had to be made for it. The player character in Fallout 4 was by far the most restrictive in any Bethesda game that I've played. Sure, you could customize how they looked and how you played the game, although the revamped perk system was quite limited, to say the least. But the personality and motivations of the player character were set. The primary goal was to find the player character's son. Sure, the player could ignore the main quests, but it's clear this was not what Bethesda intended. Furthermore, the player is forced to play the part of a caring parent. And here I'm going to go into very small spoilers for Fallout 4. One scene stood out in particular for me while I was playing, and this is when you're talking to Nick Valentine about your child. I realized that no matter which option I chose, I had no choice but to be a sympathetic and caring parent. And it was at this moment I realized this was not a Bethesda game. I can no longer be the evil asshole I played in Fallout 3. Now I know what you're thinking. This is exactly what The Witcher 3 did with Geralt and Ciri. The difference is that, for one, The Witcher 3 is a more well-written game with a stronger narrative. It sacrificed that freedom, but delivered on its promise of a narrative, whereas Bethesda sacrificed the freedom and failed to deliver on its promise of a narrative. The fact that your character is forced to be sympathetic is the problem. It's the fact that I was not invested in that character's sympathies that was the problem. Whereas The Witcher, you do care about Ciri the way Geralt does. There's no such build-up in the Fallout. Ultimately, you only care for your child because the game is forcing you to. The problem also comes down to marketing and player expectations. The Witcher 3 does not hide what it is. It wasn't advertising itself as one thing and then became something else. It was very clear. This is a heavy narrative experience that will be somewhat limited with the role-playing and customization department. However, with Fallout though, this wasn't the case. Most players, myself included, were expecting another typical Bethesda game with the freedom to be whoever I want and do things however I want. This was not given to us, and the narrative that was provided was too weak to make up for this loss of player agency. The point is to show that the middle ground between blank slate and predetermined player characters is hard to find, which is why most RPGs go one way or the other in regards to the player character.
What do you need of Zawa?
To conclude, player characters in role-playing games are critically important to its success. Both blank slate player characters and predetermined ones are great in their own ways and offer differing experiences. The predetermined PC allows for a stronger overall narrative, while the blank slate player character allows for more player freedom and agency. A role-playing game can be great with either one, but it is important to do either one properly. As we have seen, it is very difficult for a game to try to please both sides, with only all-time classics like Knights of the Old Republic pulling it off, whereas more recent attempts like Fallout 4 have failed. Ultimately, I hope those of you who've watched this video or listened to this can be convinced to be open to trying a role-playing game that has a player character not in the style that you're used to. I know some people who have trouble with games like The Witcher because they miss that freedom. What I hope you've learned from this is that what you gain in return can be worth it. This doesn't have to be an either-or kind of scenario. You should be able to enjoy both, as they both provide unique gaming experiences.
She saw me as chieftain, leading a host of Nalpazga warriors to victory over our enemies, the Quetzalcoatl. Our last chieftain had died over the winter. A new one had not yet arisen from the Nalpazga. So the timing was right. The next day they brought me before Ishipilo, the great master of the Nalpazga, and I became his pupil. I still trained with the other instructors, sparred and meditated with my Nalpazga brothers and sisters. I learned from all of them. But learning from Ishipilo was a chieftain's privilege. He knew the secrets that could grant mastery over reality, invincibility in combat. When a Nalpazga was deemed a worthy successor to a chieftain, greater than all his peers, Ishipilo would take him in, prepare him for the future. I would not be as I am now without his lessons. Not all of them. A story for another time, perhaps.